Hello. Today we are meeting again at Brand Institute of Forensics and Security. The topic is basic investigation skills. Today we shall be discussing topic number 3, which are the 5 steps in investigation process. The 5 steps in investigation process. This is very important to you as an investigator to understand which steps do I need to follow when I am conducting investigations. Once again, my name is Mr. Wayne Maganishko, a director at Brand Institute of Forensics and Security. Happy to be presenting to you the following slides. First of all, before we go to the 5 principles, let us talk of something that is very important in the investigation arena. Let us talk of the principle of exchange. The principle of exchange. The principle of exchange states that whenever two people come into contact with each physical transfer occurs. Whenever two people or two objects come into contact with each other, a physical transfer occurs. Remember, we are talking about people and we also objects. Hair, skin cells, clothing fibers, pollen, glass fragments, debris from a person's clothing, makeup, a number of different types of material can be transferred from one person to another. When two people come into contact, physical transfer of materials that we have occurs. To a forensic examiner, these transferred materials constitute what is called trace evidence. To a forensic examiner, these transfers constitute what is called trace evidence. So can you please note down trace evidence? Trace evidence. So I want you to note down what we call trace evidence. And then now we look at the history of trace evidence. A history of trace evidence. There is a person who was called Dr. Edmond Locard, director of the world's first forensic laboratory in Lyon, France. He established several important ideas that are still a part of forensic studies today. The first principle number 1 of Edmond Locard, the director of the world's forensic laboratory in Lyon, France. Remember, we have our own forensic laboratory at Kiambu, along Kiambu Road, a criminal investigation department. I saw sometimes, I think it was last year when it was being launched, I would visit this one and see for myself what equipment it contains as it relates to investigations. I think it is a good idea if we can as security professionals this expensive laboratory and see what it contains and what we are talking about. So the first principle of Locard's exchange states that when a person comes into contact with another person, a cross transfer of physical evidence can occur. This is what we have discussed previously. The exchange materials indicate that the two objects were in contact. Remember, we spoke about people and we also spoke about objects coming into contact with each other. A cross transfer of materials occur. For example, a car driving along the highway and then it slightly touches on a wall, or definitely there will be an exchange of materials. There will be an exchange of materials when these two come into contact. The second part of Locard's principle states that the intensity and the nature of the materials in contact determine the extent of the transfer. So note those things down. The second principle states that the intensity, duration, and exchange and nature of materials determine the extent of transfer. So if it is a huge impact, then definitely the extent of transfer of material from one object to the other will be of significant amount. If it is just a small touch, then the transfer will be to a lower extent. More transfer would be noted if two individuals engaged in a fist fight. than if a person simply passed another person. Whenever he steps, whenever he touches, whatever he lives, even unconsciously, will serve as silence evidence against him. What we are meaning to say that when does anything, whenever a person touches anything, whenever a person lives, whenever even subconsciously, unconsciously, definitely this will serve as silent evidence against this particular person pertaining to an investigation. Not only his fingerprints or his footprints, but his hair, the fibers from his clothes, the glass he breaks, the tool mark he leaves, the paint he scratches, blood or semen he deposits or collects. All this and more bear more witness against him. We are now talking about a suspect or a criminal, a culprit. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. It is factual evidence. Physical cannot be wrong. It cannot perjure itself. It cannot be wholly absent. Physical evidence cannot be wrong. Cannot perjure itself. It cannot be absent. Only its interpretation, only its interpretation can err. Only human failure to find it, study, and understand it can diminish its value. Physical evidence is very important to investigation. Powell Crime Investigation, John Wally and Sons, Canada, Limited, 1953, stated that every incident, be it a crime, accident, armed conflict, or other, leaves traces at the scene. Every incident leaves traces at the scene. For you to be an effective investigator, you must put that in mind. That yes, so long as there was contact between two people or between two objects, just keep in your mind that there is evidence, physical evidence exists. Goal of the subsequent investigation is to correctly interpret the facts, reconstruct the events, and understand what happened. The goal of the subsequent investigation is to interpret the facts, reconstruct the events, and understand what happened. And I would like you to remind, I don't know how you'll do it, but so that we are together, remind me to do a presentation on reconstruction of incidences. How do you reconstruct crime? How do you reconstruct what happened so that you may into understanding exactly how these things occurred or exactly what happened. I think I will anyway remember it by myself. I will do a presentation of crime scene, even though it is outside the scope of this course, but I will do it. History of trace evidence. We have seen that Dr. Edward Edmond, while Leon France was the first person who came up with the idea of trace evidence. Trace evidence can be found on both persons and objects because of this cross transfer. The exchange bears a silent witness to the criminal act. Lockhart used to transfer trace evidence from under a female's victim's fingernails to help identify her attacker. Lockhart used the transfer or trace evidence from under a female victim's fingernails to help identify her attacker. Examples of trace evidence. Examples of trace evidence. Hair on your clothes or rags. Hair on your brush. Fingerprints on a glass. You touch a glass and the fingerprints, you leave there. That is an example of trace. Soil tracked into your house on your shoes. A drop of blood on a t-shirt. I used facial tissue. Paint chips, broken glass, a fiber from DC. I want you as a student to think more about examples of the trace evidences. Now we come to the main topic. I just wanted us to open discussion by first discussing about the principle of exchange, which was first brought into the attention of investigators by one Dr. Edward Edmond in Lyon, France. The principle is in two. Number one states that whenever two persons or two objects come together, there is a transfer of material. And the principle number two states that the intensity, the duration, and the time that these people come together or the impact makes it possible that we have a larger extent. The extent of transfer depends on duration that these objects were together, the impact, or how the intensity, how these people each other. And we spoke about fist fighting. And if people are fist fighting, then the transfer of material will be to a larger extent compared to just a person touching another person. To topic 3, which is the 5 steps in investigation process. We said earlier during introduction, investigation is similar to research conducted in the academic arena. In research, there are steps similar to investigation. There are steps that we follow. Number 1 is introduction. The investigative process must follow 5 steps. These are of the problem. What's the statement of the problem? Formation of hypothesis, observation and experimentation, interpretation of facts and data, and a drawing of. So the 5 steps, write it down. The 5 steps are a statement of the problem, formation of hypothesis, observation and experiment, interpretation of data, and the drawing of conclusions. I hope you understand it, and I hope you will keep it on your fingertips. That one is very important. Full resolution of any investigative assignment, the scientific procedure must be employed in detail to give order and direction. For a resolution of any investigative assignment, this scientific procedure must be employed in detail to give order and direction. So the details of the steps that we are going to discuss are as follows. Number 1, identify and state the problem. So you as an investigator, you first must identify and state the problem. What are we dealing with? Dealing with theft? Are we dealing with assault? Are we dealing with rape? Are we dealing with an accident? What are we dealing with? What are we investigating? As an investigator, the first thing you must is to correctly identify the problem that you are going to investigate. This is important because if you get it wrong at the first step, then all is lost. It involves considering the problem. Consider the problem in totality, in whole. What happened, on which date, where did it happen, how did it happen, what was the impact. You have to take all this into consideration and state the problem. The investigator must not just think about the need to identify and arrest a suspect, but to concede the whole problem. For instance, one must clearly state offense to be investigated is theft, housebreaking, or burglary. You must also note that everything must be done within the legal guidelines. This includes identifying and arresting the suspects. Note that operations outside the law will not only lead to acquittal of suspects if they land in court, but may also put us in trouble. These legal guidelines must be considered when stating the problem for an accurate picture to be painted. So you must follow guidelines. What are the guidelines for investigations? And those are some of the things that we are going to talk about as we continue with our course. Step 2 is to form a theory or about the problem. This involves taking the tentative position about some aspects of the matter under investigation. For instance, When something has gotten lost from a room, we may attentively contact that the visitor who has just left took it. This step in the investigation process involves taking position on the possible motive of the act, the person who might have been involved, among other things. So, form a theory or hypothesis is number two. Number one is to state the problem. Number two is to form a theory or a hypothesis about, think about the problem. What could have happened or who could have done these things? Form a hypothesis. For example, in case of an arson is a deliberately attack on a building, you may take preliminary positions so that the owners may be involved to get insurance claims, or it has been done by the business company murder cover-up. Those are some of the hypotheses that this could be a murder cover-up. This could have been done deliberately to get insurance premiums or similar hypothesis. Your hypothesis must not be too narrow or too broad. You must also not be guided by personal bias. Hypothesis formation is guided by possible motives and means. Motive is that which caused a person to opportunity, the occasion, or a chance to commit a crime means the crime was committed. So motive. What could have been the motive? What could have been the reason behind this person committing this particular crime? And then step number three. So step number one, step number two is state the hypothesis or form a theory. Step number three is observation and experimentation. This is the third stage in the investigative process. Here, the investigator should ask him or whether the adduced evidence and theory or hypothesis support each other. This is done by evaluating the hypothesis, vice versa, in light of all the information obtained in the course of the investigation. So, and experimentation. Observation and experimentation is step number three. And then the detective hypothesis is also tested for accuracy by the observation evidence collected. If at this step the hypothesis formed and the evidence adduced does not agree, then the investigator must form another hypothesis and take a different approach to the investigation. Say you may form a hypothesis and then you find that the evidence is not in line with your theory or your hypothesis, then at this stage you may need to go back to the drawing board and form a hypothesis. Take another different approach to the investigation. Step number four is interpretation of data. Interpretation of data. Data means that the investigators at this step must evaluate all the evidence adduced through suspects and witness statements and personal observations in order to reach a conclusion. The investigator must weigh these sources. You must weigh these sources. Interpretation of data. Don't just take anything at face value and don't leave out important information by taking things for granted. You must be very thorough. You must interpret data correctly so that you arrive at a conclusion that will stand the test of time. So interpretation of data is very important. It must be done correctly. For instance, if a forged document was presented at a bank at a particular date, and the accused person signed it at the bank, the statement of the signatures, experts and bank tellers evidence of both positively identify the suspect in identification parade will weigh much more than a colleague of the suspect who insists they were with him at the workplace at that particular time because he failed to make a false statement. Interpretation is very important. When, however, discrepancies and inconsistencies are noticed with witnesses who cannot report facts as they claimed earlier to have witnessed, the investigators must at all times proceed carefully because not all witnesses are totally truthful. Some witnesses come forward to cover up for other people. They behave like they are true witnesses, and yet internally they are covering the suspects. So you must be very, very, very careful when interpreting data. Step number 5 is a drawing of conclusion. This is the last step. It is normally guided by both inductive and deductive reasoning, which help the investigator to reach final conclusion concerning the witness, evidence, and the motivation in the investigator uses proven truthful facts. He or she will be able to draw meaningful conclusions concerning all aspects of the case on who, what, when, and how the act was committed. So drawing of conclusion is very, very important. And when you draw conclusion, remember, you will then have to write a final report, especially at organizational level. You have to write a final report that you will submit to the management, and the management will act on this report to make decisions. So your investigation must be on point. Your investigation must be on point. Your report must be on point. I can tell you, there is nothing serious as a failed investigation and a report that is concluded to be useless. That you write a report and you submit it to the management, and they send it back to you, and they tell you it contains so many errors that we cannot rely on this investigation. We cannot rely on this report to make a decision. It's serious to a security professional. It is very serious to a security professional. So when you are conducting investigation, you have to be thorough. You have to follow the steps carefully to make sure that you arrive at conclusions true. And then, for example, the final step, the investigator draws his or her conclusions that the accused committed the act being investigated or did not. This must be supported by as many facts uncovered during investigation as possible, such as the victim's witness statements and physical evidences. Your reports must be supported. Investigation report, your final investigation outcome, the conclusion you draw must be supported by victim witness statements and the physical evidence gathered during the investigation. We are going to talk more about these evidences as we move along, but for today we look at a summary. We say that an investigation is like a scientific investigation passes through 5 logical steps. These are statement of the problem, formation of theory or hypothesis, observation and experimentation, interpretation of data, and deductions. Those are the stages that an investigation follows. For a successful resolution of any investigations, this procedure must be followed for successful outcome. For outcome, you must follow this procedure so that you arrive at a true picture of the incident and who was involved and how did it happen, and then you a very strong report you submit to the management, and you will have put yourself in a good picture as a successful, efficient, competent security professional. Remember, hypothesis theory is a tentative statement not yet proved, meant to explain a position or an occurrence. Reasoning involves application of general principles that will yield a specific conclusions about facts in a case. Inductive reasoning, this is a kind of reasoning which starts with a number of specific facts of a case. From them to be a broader legal principle that will inductive reasoning. This is a kind of starts with a number of specific facts of a case. It infers from them and borders on legal principles that have to be interpreted correctly to make of the case in question clear. So that is inductive reasoning, and there is a reasoning involves application of general principles, and then hypothesis. It is a theory statement not yet proved, meant to explain a position or an occurrence. We have come to the end of this presentation, which was very short. We have used only 25 minutes, so we shall use. I want to try my level best to cover this outline topics as they are outlined in the Brand Institute of Forensics handout. However, so that we get time to cover also topics that are outside the scope of this training, but that are very important to you as an investigator. And that is why I said, if you don't attend class throughout, you may miss out a lot. You may, because there are other presentations that we are going to cover that are beyond the scope of this course, because we really want you to have as much information as possible so that your investigation is correct, so that your investigation stands the test of time, so that you put yourself in a good picture as a professional security investigator, professional security manager, or officer. With those few remarks, I say thank you. We will meet again for the next lesson.